Hello again, feral friends and fellow nature nerds. The focus for today's episode was inspired by a recent nature encounter that I had. Now, if you happen to listen to the last Dirt Dispatch episode, or, read the title of this one, you know that I'm talking about a muskrat. But muskrats are often mistaken for beavers, and they do look similar, and they're both semi-aquatic rodents. But once you actually compare the two, it's pretty easy to tell them apart. And then there's another species of semi-aquatic rodent, Nutria, and those are also often confused with both muskrats and beaver. But here again, there's some pretty easy ways to distinguish the Nutria from its two cousins. Now, beaver had their own episode way back in episode 11, and in that episode I touched briefly on both Nutria and muskrats. And I also talked about Nutria in episode 36 when I talked about invasive species. But today, we're going to get a little more up close and personal with both the Nutria and the muskrat. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, and this is the Dispatches from the Forest podcast. So let's start by taking a look at the Nutria. It's not too hard to understand how Nutria can be confused with a beaver. They swim in the water and they have great big orange incisors. Although I will say, if you look up pictures of Nutria like I did when researching for this episode, they look more like a miniature version of a capybara, which is incidentally the world's largest rodent, than they do a beaver. But aside from that, how do you tell a Nutria from a beaver? Well, the first thing is size. Beavers are the second largest rodent in the world, second to the capybara. They weigh an average of between 40 and 50 pounds, 18 to 23 kilograms, although that can range from 25 pounds to over 100 pounds. Nutria, on the other hand, average closer to the 10 to 15 pound range, 4.5 to 7 kilograms. But again, that can range from 9 to 35 pounds. But yeah, okay, there's some overlap between the smallest of the beavers and the largest Nutria. But what other features distinguish a Nutria from a beaver? Well, the next most obvious thing would be the tail. You probably know what a beaver's tail looks like. It's hairless, it's wide, it's horizontally flat. A Nutria's tail, on the other hand, is hairless, but it's round like a rat's. Other features that might help with identification are more prominent ears than a beaver and a white muzzle. But unlike both beaver and muskrats, Nutria are not native to North America or Europe. They're native to subtropical and temperate South America, including Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, and the southern parts of Brazil and Bolivia. They were introduced into Europe and North America primarily by fur ranchers as a beaver substitute when both the Eurasian and North American beavers were nearly wiped out in the name of fashion, specifically felt hats. Nutria have 3 layers of fur. The outer coat consists of long guard hairs, then there's a coarse middle layer, and finally a dense soft underfur, also called, by happenstance, the Nutria. Here in the United States, they were first introduced into California by rancher naturalist, adventurer, and writer William Franklin Frakes in 1899. After traveling to Argentina, and with the encouragement of David Starr Jordan, founding president of Stanford University, he set up a Nutria farm at his ranch, which, near as I can tell, was located just north of Los Angeles. Some of Frakes' Nutria would later escape into the wild and, as of last year, had reached as far as San Francisco Bay. In the 1930s, Nutria were brought to Louisiana, again to be raised in captivity for their fur. But as the worsening Great Depression caused a downturn in the fur industry, many of these captive animals were simply released into the wild when keeping them became unprofitable. Hurricanes in the 1940s allowed more to escape, and in 1945, E. A. McElhenney, son of the heir to the Tabasco sauce empire, released his entire stock on Avery Island in an attempt to start a new fur industry in Louisiana. Now, the distribution of Nutria outside South America tends to contract or expand depending on the severity of the winters. During very cold winters, nutria are prone to getting frostbite on those hairless tails, which can then lead to infection and death. In some places, nutria have become locally or regionally extinct. For example, Scandinavian countries of Northern Europe and the U.S. states of Idaho, Montana, and Nebraska. I mean, they are South American natives, so they did not evolve to survive the harsh winter climate found in those places. But during mild winters, the opposite is true, and their range tends to expand northward. For example, in recent years, nutria have expanded their range in Washington and Oregon in the western U.S. and up into Delaware in the east. That's more bad news when you consider a warming climate. Because here's the problem when it comes to nutria that have been introduced outside of their native range. First of all, they're prolific breeders, probably because about 80% die in the first year. And even if they survive that first year, they rarely survive more than 3. A 4-year-old nutria in the wild would be darn near ancient. Now, such a high mortality rate would seem like it would keep the population low, but they have ways to compensate for that mortality. Gestation lasts about 4 months, and litter sizes can be as many as 13, although 4 is the average. But that said, the female can get pregnant again the day after giving birth. Generally, she'll have 2 litters a year, although if the timing works out, she could potentially get pregnant 3 times a year. So assuming they survive long enough, a female nutria can produce about 6 litters in a lifetime. Young are born precocial, fully furred with eyes open, and they can eat vegetation and swim with their parents within hours of birth. Nutria babies nurse for 7 to 8 weeks and then leave their mothers. Females reach sexual maturity as early as 3 months and males as early as 4. I'm not a math guy, but even I can recognize that those numbers have the potential to get very big very quickly. But it's more than prolific breeding that makes them a problem. They can cause quite a bit of damage in the ecosystem too. Nutria consume about 25% of their body weight daily, and not only do they eat the above ground portion of plants, they often dig down to get to roots, tubers, and rhizomes, leading to erosion along the banks of streams and rivers. Plus, they feed year-round, so their impact is constant and ongoing. Wetlands cover about 5% of the lower 48 states, but they support 31% of the nation's plant species. The feeding habits of nutria have been shown to reduce overall wetland biomass, leading to the conversion of wetlands like marshes and swamps into open water. Bad news for species that depend on wetland vegetation. Nutria are also known to damage things like irrigation systems, and they'll chew through man-made items including tires and wooden house paneling. In the San Francisco area, their digging is causing damage to storm levees. And if that weren't enough, they're also vectors for a number of pathogens that can infect humans, livestock, and other wildlife. On the upside, if you're watching your weight, nutria meat is leaner and has a lower fat and cholesterol content than ground beef. In fact, in the late 90s, the state of Louisiana was encouraging more people to do what low-income rural Louisianans had been doing for decades: eat more nutria, by distributing and publishing nutria recipes, which, now that I think about it, I wonder how many of them involve Tabasco sauce. Well, I don't know about you, but I'd give a nutria burger a shot. Okay, now let's shift our attention to our native species here in North America of semi-aquatic rodent, the one that I saw that set me down this path, the muskrat. Muskrats are found in most of Canada and the United States, as well as a small part of northern Mexico, although they're actually not found in Florida, but only because there's another rodent called the round-tailed muskrat, also known as the Florida water rat, which is found there and fills the same ecological niche. Muskrat is in the name, but it's a whole different species of rodent. But our muskrats were introduced into Europe in the beginning of the 20th century, and like the nutria, they've become an invasive species in northwestern Europe. But what's the difference between a muskrat and either a beaver or a nutria? Well, to start with, again, muskrats are the smallest of the three. They max out at about 4.5 pounds, just 2 kilograms. So they weigh less than half the weight of an average nutria and about a tenth of the weight of your average beaver. And then, of course, there's the tail. Like both beaver and nutria, muskrats have a hairless, scaly tail. But the shape is unique. It's not round like the nutria or horizontally flat like the beavers. Instead, it's long and skinny, but it's slightly flattened vertically. So, kind of like a ship's rudder, but super long and flexible. And incidentally, that's exactly how it's used. The muskrat's webbed rear feet are its main source of propulsion when swimming, and the tail is used primarily for steering. Muskrats spend most of their time in the water. They can hold their breath for up to 17 minutes, about the same as a beaver. On a side note, nutria can only hold their breath for a maximum of 5. Muskrats live in families consisting of a male and female and their young, the same family group as beavers. Also, incidentally, the same grouping as coyotes and wolves, and yet you never hear anyone refer to the alpha muskrat or the pack of muskrats. Just saying. But in the spring, they do fight with other muskrats over territory and potential mates, and it's not unusual for muskrats to get injured or even killed in these skirmishes. Muskrats build nests or burrows to protect themselves and their young from both cold and predators. Muskrats will often burrow into the bank with an underwater entrance in streams, ponds, or lakes. And I suspect that the muskrat I saw here had a burrow in the bank. They might also build a structure called a push-up. Push-ups look similar to beaver lodges, except smaller and made out of mud and vegetation, like cattails and reeds, as opposed to a beaver that uses a lot of sticks and branches for its lodge. Incidentally, muskrats have also been documented living inside a beaver lodge along with the resident beavers who don't seem to mind. I don't know, maybe they just thought these were extra young beavers or like keeping them as a family pet. Push-ups can be up to 3 feet tall, 90 centimeters. In snowy areas, muskrats will plug the entrance hole with vegetation, which they replace daily. This helps keep the nest warmer and protects it from predators. Depending on where it's built, though, push-ups can be swept away during spring floods and may need to be replaced yearly. On a side note, muskrats also move into flooded areas. In 2019, when we were living in Omaha, the Missouri River flooded. Dozens of muskrat push-ups appeared on the floodplain as the muskrats were flooded out of their normal habitats. Muskrats also build feeding platforms in the water using cut pieces of vegetation supported by branches. On a side note, because I didn't mention it earlier, nutria also live in burrows in the bank, either constructing it themselves or sometimes they'll assume ownership of an abandoned muskrat burrow. And they build feeding platforms. They're also known to use muskrat push-ups or beaver lodges as feeding platforms. But neither muskrats nor nutria build dams the way beaver do. While some of the feeding habits of nutria can cause wholesale conversion of wetlands into open water, the feeding and building activities of muskrats have a much smaller impact. And in fact, by helping maintain smaller open areas in marshes, they provide habitat for aquatic birds. Also, caribou, moose, and elk are known to use muskrat push-ups as a food source during the winter if other food is scarce. Muskrats themselves feed primarily on cattails and other aquatic vegetation. In fact, about 95% of their diet is vegetation. But unlike beaver and nutria, muskrats are omnivores, so they will also eat small animals like freshwater mussels, fish, frogs, crayfish, and small turtles. Muskrats don't hibernate, and they don't store food for the winter per se, but sometimes they'll use the inside of their push-up as a source of food if they need it. They make trails in swamps and ponds, and they'll continue to use these trails under the ice when the water freezes. Now, like nutria, muskrats are prolific breeders. Females can have 2 or 3 litters a year of 6 to 8 kits each. Unlike nutria, though, kits are born small and hairless. In southern environments, kits mature in about 6 months, while in colder northern environments, it can take up to a year. Lifespan in the wild is generally 3 to 4 years, but they can live up to 10 in captivity. But muskrat populations tend to go through a regular cycle of rise followed by dramatic decline spread over a 6 to 10 year period. Now, this isn't uncommon in the rodent family. For example, lemmings go through a similar population cycle. But that said, overall in the United States, muskrats are struggling, mostly because of habitat destruction caused by draining wetlands for development, not to mention the competition and other problems caused by their Nutria cousins. Populations have declined by at least half in 34 states since the 1990s, and in some states, the collapse has been near total, between 90 and 99%. In Rhode Island, the muskrat population is estimated to be roughly 15% of what it was several decades ago. But I'll leave you with this. Native Americans considered the muskrat to be a very important animal. Some believed you could predict winter snowfall by observing the size and timing of muskrat push-up construction. And in several Native American creation myths, it's the muskrat that dives to the bottom of the primordial sea to bring up the mud from which the earth is created after other animals have tried and failed. And of course, let's not forget the 1970s hit song Muskrat Love, which is literally about two muskrats named Susie and Sam and features deep, meaningful lyrics like these. Nibbling on bacon, chewing on cheese, Sam says to Susie, "Honey, would you please be my missus?" Susie, she says yes with her kisses. Now he's tickling her fancy, rubbing her ties. Muzzle to muzzle now, anything goes. As they wiggle, Susie starts to giggle. And they whirl and they twirl and they tango, singing and jingling a jango, floating like the heavens above. Looks like muskrat love. And on that note, I'll say thank you once again for tuning in. If you'd like to support the podcast, well, that would be fantastic. Here's some ways you can do that. Become a patron. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and with 3 paid months, you get some sweet Dispatches from the Forest merchandise. Visit patreon.com/dispatches from the forest to find out all the details. If a one-time donation is more your thing, you can do that through PayPal using my email address, dispatchesfromtheforest@gmail.com, which is also, of course, where you can email me if you have a question or a comment or a request for a future episode. You can make a one-time donation using the Cash App and the hashtag ForestNerd. How about getting some Dispatches from the Forest merch? You can find the merch store at cafepress.com/shop/Dispatches from the Forest. Then just click on products and find something you like. Finally, follow Dispatches from the Forest on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. I'm your host, Tim the Nature Nerd O'Hara, reminding you to go outside and get dirty. And, save a marsh, eat a nutria. The Dispatches from the Forest podcast is a production of Dispatches from the Forest, may not be used or rebroadcast whole or in part without express written permission.